Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the very first Design at Large seminar for the new academic year. We've got an absolutely packed house, more than packed. We've got a virtual audience downstairs, and we're thrilled to have Kentaro Toyama here. I've followed Kentaro's work for a number of years, from when he was the one of the folks leading Microsoft Research India. And many of my PhD students and collaborators were really inspired by Kentaro's vision for ICTs for the developing world. And I think, Kentaro spent a number of years on the ground doing work and had a lot of insights that came out of that. He recently is back in the US. He's now the W.K. Kellogg Associate Professor of Community Information at the University of Michigan. He's also a fellow of the Dalai Lama Center for Ethics and Transformative Values at MIT. And he's the author of a new book that came out this May. It's called Geek Heresy. And I think many of the ideas from the book Kentaro is going to cover today. Here in the Design Lab, we're really excited about trying to do work that spans disciplines and points of view. And I can't think of a better person to kick off that aspiration than somebody who's succeeded so well at it, which is Kentaro.
Thank you, Scott. Thanks for that very kind introduction. As you heard, I was at Microsoft Research. Actually, before going to India, I did research in computer vision. And in 2004, I moved to India to help start the research lab there. That lab looked like this at the time. They've since moved into a different building. But it was a very unique lab. On the one hand, we wanted to be as good a computer science research lab as possible. On the other hand, we often had cows walking in front of us. And this kind of shows the contrast that is India, to the extent that you can show it in one slide, which is to say, this is a country that has an incredibly well-developed, highly capable IT industry, and at the same time, it is still one of the world's poorest countries, especially for the for approximately 800 million people who still earn less than $2 US per day. So when I moved there, I changed research direction, and this was part of the reason why I moved there was because I was interested in seeing if we could apply different uses of computers and electronic technologies to the problems of the developing world. Could we use PCs to help alleviate poverty? Could we use mobile phones to address healthcare? Could we use the internet to do something for education and so on? And our overall methodology throughout was actually drawn very much from both design and human-computer interaction traditions, which is to say, our first goal was always to really understand the communities that we worked with, and we often went in without, a thought as to whether a technology solution would exist. But oftentimes they would reveal things that we thought were amenable to a technology solution. And then we would go through a design phase where we would prototype things, iterate, try them with the communities that we were working with, get their feedback and so on. And if we thought that we had a design that actually had some impact, we would move to an evaluation phase where, to the extent possible, we did randomized controlled trials. Other times we did, use quasi-experimental methods. Because we're a research lab, we did not focus on implementing the results of our work. We generally assumed that we would transfer them to partners. In many cases, we did our projects with nonprofit organizations or local government agencies, and so in some cases they would take them up. In a couple of cases, we spun off our projects as separate organizations. So there's still a nonprofit organization called Digital Green that operates in India, and it's probably rolled out one of our most impactful projects. And as I mentioned, we had all kinds of different projects. Over the little over 5 years that I was there, I think I either directly was involved in or supervised some 50-odd projects. And again, these were using PCs, mobile phones, digital cameras, sometimes custom hardware that we designed, and to address problems in agriculture, healthcare, microfinance, education, governance, and so forth. And we were certainly not alone. So around that time, there was increasing interest in trying to see different ways of applying digital technologies to the big challenges of the world. And in 2011, this is half a decade afterwards, but in 2011, we saw potentially a significant example of this in where social media contributed in some way to the revolutions of the Arab Spring. Hillary Clinton basically saw that, and she said access to information helps citizens hold their own governments accountable. In education, we're seeing more and more desire to see technology in education. So Arne Duncan, who's the United States Secretary of Education, says that technology is a game changer in the field of education, a game changer we desperately need to both improve achievement for all and increase equity. And then finally, here's Mark Zuckerberg, Facebook CEO, who says that the richest 500 million people have way more money than the next 6 billion combined. You solve that by getting everyone online. Okay, so what all of these statements have in common is that they're all suggesting that some kind of technology, in these examples, digital technology, will contribute in a significant way to improving government, improving education, or improving the situation with inequality in the world, right? I mean, these are very big statements. If you go back even 30 years, it was not as typical that you would hear these kinds of statements. But now these things have become very commonplace. In fact, just a couple of days ago, Mark Zuckerberg and Bono had an op-ed in the New York Times, again, pushing this idea that the internet was going to solve our global challenges. In the design world, here is the Field Guide to Human-Centered Design from IDEO, a very well-known design house. And basically, they are also jumping on to this particular idea, which is to say that embracing human-centered design means believing that all problems, even the seemingly intractable ones like poverty, gender equality, and clean water, are solvable, right? So this is again a significant statement about what design can do to address some of the world's biggest problems. So I'm going to cast a little bit of doubt on some of these statements, and I'll take you through a little bit of the path that I took to get there, and I'll also ask you a few questions so that because there's a particular conceptual framework that I think really helps explain all of these things, and I'm going to try to give you some intuition by asking some questions about it. So first, let me talk about one of the projects that we did. So this is called text-free user interfaces. And the basic idea was that we want to address this problem. So it's a little bit fuzzy, but that's good. Apart from the people who can read or speak Japanese or Chinese, okay, what do you think this website is about?
Social networks.
Social networks. Anybody else? Shop. Anybody else?
Dating.
Dating. Okay, all good guesses. It is the equivalent of a job search website in Japan. Now, our claim was that if you are illiterate, this is what the internet looks like to you for the most part, right? It looks like there's some interesting things going on. You're pretty sure that there's useful information, but you can't, for the life of yourself, decipher what it is. So our question was initially, how can we design UIs such that people who are illiterate could make use of certain classes of digital technology? And we spent quite a few years investigating this problem in different ways. And I'm going to actually jump to to a particular aspect of it. So we found that that people actually did very well. Obviously images and audio are the key to getting around using text. But we found that, for example, that using hand-drawn cartoons was more effective than using photos as a representation of generic objects. We found that if you had a video that kind of explained the overall, not only the overall context of how to use an application, but also how information got into the computer, how you could make use of an application was really helpful as an introductory way for people who had otherwise not interacted with computers to use, and so on and so forth. But one of the things that we noticed as we were doing this was that we got to a certain point where the interfaces that we designed were able to be used by people who were illiterate. But what we found was that even among illiterate people, there was this difference. Some people could navigate these websites very, very easily. Other people had a challenge, despite the fact that they were illiterate and despite the fact that we did everything we could to make it usable for people who couldn't read. And our hypothesis was, this is Indrani Mehdi who led most of this research, our hypothesis was that the people who had more education and who had more cognitive capacity were also the ones who could navigate these websites the best. So we did a very specific study in which we basically had different people go through an exercise where they navigated kind of a menu structure and with different degrees of hierarchical nesting in the menus. I'm not going to go through the results of the whole study there, but one of the things that came out was that our hypothesis was there was evidence for a hypothesis. So namely, depending on how well you did on an abstract reasoning exercise using Raven's matrices, your performance on these kind of navigational tests was better. So for example, if you were better at abstract reasoning as measured by Raven's matrices, you would get more tasks correct and you would take less time. But we also found that on the whole, people struggled with the nested structures. The more nested something was, the harder it was for everybody. Nevertheless, there was a difference between how people performed. And the basic insight is actually kind of obvious, which is that the more cognitive capacity you have, the more you can take advantage of computer user interfaces, especially when they become more complex. Okay, so this combined with other things that we saw routinely in our projects. So these other problems were basically that we would often have great research results, where some technology helped, let's say, with student education or helped deliver healthcare in a certain way. But then when we tried to roll them out at a bigger scale with partner organizations, they inevitably did not, they would often not have the results that we saw in our research. And so the question was, why did this consistently happen? So one explanation is actually in slides like this, where basically there's some correlation with performance and capacity. Okay, and over time I began to see this over and over. So this is another study that was done in our lab in which, in this case, we basically were interested in whether or not we could actually add a little bit of text for people who had some literacy. And what we found there was that that text helped, but it helped most the people who were already reasonably literate. It helped a little bit for people who were somewhat literate, and it didn't help much for people who were completely illiterate. Here's a study that is in a very different context, very different exercise, not in our lab. This is a situation in which the question was, does a mobile phone help you be a better entrepreneur? And what they found was that if you come in being a confident, capable entrepreneur, you actually get more value out of a mobile phone than if you're not a good entrepreneur to begin with, right? So that's what these different slopes show. This was a study in a healthcare context in which the idea was to use SMS reminders, text message reminders to field community health workers as a way to make sure that they were meeting with the patients that they were supposed to on their rounds. And what they did was they initially started off with this SMS messaging system and a human supervisor who would, reprimand people who weren't doing the rounds and so on, versus a control situation where they got no supervision whatsoever. And you can see that there's a difference between, of course, having the SMS text message reminders and the supervisor. And then at some point they said, let's see if the text messages by themselves do the trick. And what they found over time was that eventually the messaging by itself actually reverted to a situation that was very much like the control. In other words, sending the messages by themselves doesn't get these health workers to, to improve their job without some kind of human supervision involved. And so, these are very different contexts, but if there's one thing that you can draw out of them, it is that the technology is amplifying some underlying human capacity, both in terms of the degree to which people are using the technology to their advantage, but also with respect to whether the technology is helping or not. So in those contexts where we worked with good schools or good healthcare organizations, the technology could amplify that and make things better. In those situations where the institutions were dysfunctional in some way, it didn't make a difference how good our technology was. Things did not get better. Now, this is not a new idea. And in fact, I'm constantly on the lookout for where these kinds of statements are made. I'm going to ask this group who wrote this passage. Okay? Will the continual stream of messages from wearable devices prove to be irresistible, diverting me from my work, or will they amplify my abilities? It all depends on whether we use them to focus and augment our activities or to distract. It's up to us to decide which it is to be. Any ideas on who wrote this? I'll give you a hint. It's somebody in the room.
Gee, I think I
Yes, so Don wrote this, and he was, of course, talking about wearable devices in a very different context. But in this situation, he used the word amplify, and it's exactly the sense that I'm trying to use it. I'm going to suggest that this or is actually not an or. And we actually had a conversation that suggests that he agrees with that as well, which is to say that the wearable devices, when they're diverting you, they're actually amplifying something else that is in you. And that is also being amplified. And the technology amplifies both. Now, you might see that as a negative thing, but as far as the technology is concerned, it is amplifying more of what you are. And we'll come back to this quote later. And as I said, this idea of amplification is not at all new. In fact, it's mentioned over and over in all kinds of different literature, in communication studies, in education, in information studies. This is a regular teacher, philosopher of technology. In economics, there's something called a Cobb-Douglas function which explains how economic output is a product of technology and financial capital and human capital. So if you ignore the financial capital, basically it's multiplying technology times human capacity. Nevertheless, I do think that this idea is underappreciated. And so now I want to get into a little bit of how it's actually underappreciated. So imagine that you and it says poor rural farmer here, but just imagine the poorest person you know. And imagine it's somebody who is involuntarily poor. Okay, I'm not asking you to imagine a very happy monk or a nun. Somebody who's involuntarily poor. Now, imagine that you and that person have unlimited, free, high bandwidth access to the internet over the period of a week. And your goal is to raise as much money as you can for whatever charity of your choice. Okay, who do you think would be able to raise more money? You or this extremely poor person? Who thinks you? Okay, most hands. Who thinks the other person? Okay, we have one dissident. For the people who said that you would be able to, why?
You know what to do.
You know what to do? Okay, in what sense?
Well, you know where to look for money, how to ask for it, how to,
Great, you know where to look for money, you know how to ask, you know how to ask for it. Good, what else?
richer friends in your social network.
Excellent, you have richer friends, you have a richer social network. Good, what else?
Maybe you care about nonprofit organizations more?
Okay, you might care about nonprofit organizations more. Good, these are all good answers.
Yeah, you're probably more familiar with the tools.
You're more familiar with the tools, absolutely. Don, I'm kind of curious as to why you said the other person.
Because you're the target population and you represent exactly the kind of person that is to be helped, which I think is a much more meaningful way of attracting donors. In fact, it's
I think you are right in the sense that when nonprofits market, for money, it really helps to isolate one person to do it.
Yeah.
But at least in my experience, when that person themselves goes out to seek money, it does not work out as well as a very clever marketing person.
The people mentioned, maybe they don't know how.
Yes.
They don't know who to address.
That's right. And so the point I want to make there is that, in this situation, the technology is exactly the same, right? But the outcomes are different based on who you are, who you know, what you're capable of. And so, this idea that the internet democratizes in and of itself has this deep flaw in some aspect of it. There are other statements about technology that people say, such as the world is flat or that technology levels the playing field. And I want to suggest that you can run the same experiment imagining yourself versus Bill Clinton or Bill Gates. And we will lose, right? And it's for the same exact reasons.
Democratizes isn't the same as socializes.
Yeah, that's fair. I think whenever people say the internet democratizes, it means a lot of different things in different contexts, but a lot of it is somehow it's making the world a fairer place in and of itself. And what I'm suggesting is that's not necessarily the case. Okay, next, let me ask these three questions in succession. Raise your hand if you believe they are true. Okay, so are you as rich as you like to be? Anybody? Okay, a couple people very content, mostly faculty, I noticed. Are you as educated as you like to be? Anybody? Okay, good, a couple people. Are you as compassionate as you like to be? Okay, a couple people. Okay, so first of all, I didn't notice that nobody raised their hand to all three questions, although there were a couple hands in each case. Now I'm going to suggest that as to how to accomplish these things, everybody in this room has all the information they need to do it. And that's because we have the internet and we have Google. So for example, if you search on Google for how to be rich, there are 41 million hits, at least that was true when I first did this. A lot of these are crackpot web pages, but some of them have very good advice, right? Are you as educated like to be? Well, thanks to massive open online courses these days, you can get just about any kind of education that you want. And as for compassion, I found a web page with the Dalai Lama saying, a guide to cultivating compassion in your life with 7 practices. So the knowledge is out there and it's at your fingertips. Why is it that we are not all answering yes to these things? The information is there. Time it takes. Motivation.
Unlimited appetite.
Unlimited appetite, right? So maybe, yeah, you'll never be satisfied. That's all true, right? So here what I'm going to suggest is that this notion that some form of information or something that digital technology can easily deliver is the bottleneck is very often not the case. We often mistake education as being the provision of information. In fact, that was the original conception of MOOCs, was that, hey, now we have all these lectures online, everybody can get an education. But every student in here knows that, you're not paying for the textbook. You are paying for the social pressure that your professors and your peers provide to make you do that work, right? Similarly, communication in and of itself doesn't bring peace. One of the interesting things in the United States is that we now are more interconnected than ever before, and yet we appear to be more politically polarized than before. How is it that possible if it was just the connection that would bring us together? And similarly, technology and economic growth. All right, next I'm going to ask everybody to start off with your hands up. So everybody raise your hands. Yeah, good. In the overflow room as well. OK. So now I'm going to ask you to lower your hands when you see a question to which the answer is no. OK. So should members of the army have guns? OK. Most people think yes. OK. Should police officers have guns? OK. A few people don't believe that. Should ordinary civilians have guns? OK. More hands have gone down. Should 5-year-old children have guns? OK. Most hands down. I always have, in some audiences, still, there will be some people with their hands up, so I have to ask this last question, which is, should convicted serial murderers have guns? So, here I'm talking about a very different kind of technology, which is the gun, but what's interesting is that for each of you, there was some point at which you thought the same technology is going to be used for good or bad based on who is in control and what their intentions are, right? Which is to suggest, once again, that the technology itself changes polarity in terms of whether it is likely to be used in a good way or a positive way based on the person. And this is true just as much with digital technologies as with anything else. We actually, once upon a time, the kinds of discussions we're now having about the internet were had about TV. So in the 1960s, America went through a phase when they thought television could replace schools altogether, because here was a technology that was going to pipe audio and video right into everybody's living room. Why do kids ever need to make that trek to school? They can just learn as this information washes over them. Now we know that people actually don't do that with their TVs. They watch reality TV instead. So people's less than positive intentions are also amplified. So let me go back to these earlier claims. I mean, these are all very successful people, very intelligent people. How can they get away with saying things like this? And of course, here's the one on design. So I want to give a couple of examples where a human-centered design process resulted in some very clever artifacts, but which somehow failed to have the impact that they were initially designed for. And this play pump is a very famous example. So here the idea was, many communities in the developing world have problems with getting enough water, right? And so what they did was they went into these communities, they talked to villagers, and the villagers said, look, we have to pump water all the time, it's a real pain, and the water is running out, what do we do? So some clever designers said, let's build a thing where children can play at spinning this thing, and it pumps the water out of the aquifer and into this tank, where now it's much more easy to retrieve because you don't have to keep pumping the well. These guys were amazingly successful at fundraising because it is, in fact, such a compelling idea. But it turns out that this works and actually solves a water problem in a surprisingly small fraction of the rural villages of the kind that it was meant to address. And the real issue was that the problems are far, far more complex than the question of who's pumping the water. They have to do with, are the local aquifers, in fact, drained? Do they need to drill lower to get the water? If they drill lower, who's going to replenish the water? Oftentimes, there's a question of, are the kids in a neighborhood in which this pump happens to exist. They found over time that you have to place them in schools rather than in other places. But if you put them in schools, will the parents come to pick up the water at those places, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's some cultural issues. In some cases, the women from some communities get together at the water pump, and that's where they gossip. And so, they want to do that, and they don't want to end up in a situation where they don't have time to meet with each other, and so on and so forth. This is another water addressing thing where they were trying to address the problem in a different way, using a kind of roller tank, which was meant to be easier to carry than the jerry cans that get used in a large amount of the developing world. Again, seemingly very clever. This one was featured in a Hewlett Cooper exhibition where it was called Design for the Other 90%. And it was kind of their flagship design. But it turns out years later, now we know that these things are used in a very small number of communities, but for the most part, people do not like this particular model either, because it turns out that the ground is not as easy to drag this thing over in many places. So situations where design principles were used to achieve a result which still is not solving the problem. And I would argue that it's not fundamentally that the design was bad, it's that these problems are much deeper than at least an attempt to solve with an artifact allows. Let's go back to technology and education. So the results with computers in schools are at this point very clear. There have been several randomized controls trials where people have done things like distribute laptops randomly to students. In fact, there was one study in California where they found that after 2 years, the kids with the laptops do no better in terms of their grades, in terms of their test scores, in terms of their attendance, in terms of disciplinary actions that are taken on them. Nothing that you could possibly measure that would be thought of as better learning as a result of owning the laptops. On the other hand, these kids use their computers more often for obvious reasons. What they're doing is playing video games and social media. When I came back from India, I volunteered for a while at a Seattle area nonprofit where the goal was to teach 3rd through 5th graders technology literacy. So we did things with like Lego Mindstorms. We helped these kids make their own kind of YouTube videos and so on. And what I found was that at that age group, the biggest obstacle to teaching them about technology is technology. So every time I would turn around, these kids would somewhere or other find a video game to play. And they were amazingly good at this. I would do things like shut down the internet in the classroom, make sure we deleted or at least hid all the video games, and they would still somehow find them, and then that news would get around the classroom very quickly. And what's really interesting to me these days is the following. So a couple of years after this, I was at Lakeside High School, which is the same high school that Bill Gates graduated from. And it looks like this. It looks like an Ivy League college. They have a lot of technology, understandably. The kids all tweet their sports results. The teachers post their assignments online. They email each other all the time. But what was interesting was that whenever the parents wanted a boost for their kids, they would pay for adult tutoring. So I was there as a substitute tutor, and I had all kinds of kids. Some of these kids were honors calculus students who could do better math than I could, and yet they just wanted some adult there to sound ideas off of. Some of these kids actually needed substantive help in geometry and algebra, and I was able to provide that. Some of these kids, their parents said, look, all I want you to do is sit with them and watch them do their homework, right? And so I was like, okay, I'm happy to do that. And what's interesting in all these cases is that these are parents who work at Microsoft, at Amazon, at Google, and so on. And they're sending these kids to these schools which have all the resources in the world. And when their kids need something extra, what they're paying for is adult human guidance, more intervention by adults. Right? So if this is true of some of the most privileged kids in the world, then I would argue that that's also what we need to do, even more so for the kids who are falling through the cracks. And the fact that we can assume that some form of technology is going to address that, I think, is a grave mistake. What about democracy and governance? So, back in the Arab Spring, it was often said that the Egyptian revolution was a Facebook revolution, and that was because one of the bigger protests was organized on Facebook. So let's see if that holds water as an idea. In Libya and Syria, both Gaddafi and al-Assad shut down the internet in their countries as soon as protests started because they were afraid that there was going to be a Facebook revolution. Well, in Libya, the rebels ended up eventually hunting Gaddafi down in the streets and executing him. And in Syria, we're of course now in the midst of, I think, the 4th year of this civil war, right? So without the internet, somehow these rebels kept organizing and kept fighting, right? If you believe that the internet itself is necessary for revolution, these are cases which show that that's not true. On the other hand, we have the American Revolution, which of course happened in a time when there was no internet, right? I would say that if we're going to call the Egyptian Revolution a Facebook revolution, we should be willing to call the US Revolution a lantern revolution because of Paul Revere and one if by land, two if by sea. And then finally, we have China, which now has something like 700 million internet users, over 1 billion mobile phone accounts, right? So this is a country which is by any measure not democratic, and yet there is no revolution, at least in the, at least that's coming up, right? So again, if you believe that the technology in of itself causes democratization, there's something wrong with that account. What I'm going to, if you put all these things together, basically the technology is not necessary or sufficient for causing democratization. And if that's true, we cannot say that it is a primary cause of democratization. Okay, finally, what about inequality? So I talked a little bit about education already. One of the interesting things about MOOCs is that initially they were thought to be a way to address the educational inequality in this country, right? Now we have free lectures online. Anybody with access to the internet can go and get a college education. And in America, everybody basically has access to the internet through their public libraries. Several years later, the data is out, and multiple of these platforms have found that their predominant course completion is done by college-educated professionals who have jobs, not unemployed, jobless high school dropouts, right? Which suggests that something other than the fact of providing these platforms free is required for education. And again, I think it's adult supervision. Here's a more fun example. Okay, so Kickstarter has been widely cited as having democratized fundraising. Now anybody can fundraise. So a couple years ago, Zach Braff, the well-known actor and director, decided that he was going to kickstart to fundraise for an independent movie he wanted to make. He raised over $3 million at the end of his campaign. The average Kickstarter campaign raises $6,000, right? So here you see a situation where something that's supposed to have leveled the playing field of fundraising has a huge difference based on whether you are already well-known and popular versus whether you have a limited circle of friends. And finally, here's the situation in the United States overall. So this green line shows the rate of poverty in the United States. It basically was declining since about 1940 until about 1970. And then something interesting happened in this country to which I don't think anybody really knows the answer, but multiple people have explained that something happened in the 70s, which has caused the following thing, which is the poverty really basically flatlined. It has not really improved or gotten significantly worse, although because the population is growing, the number in poverty has increased. So during the same 4 decades since the 1970s, we have had basically the digital revolution, right? So if you believe that the invention of technologies by itself and the spread of them is going to address serious social ills, then I'm going to suggest that this juxtaposition of these two things shows that that's not enough, that you need something else. And so what is that something else? Well, if you go back to amplification, basically the idea, what this is showing is that we as a country in the United States are not focused on eliminating poverty in this country, as politically, socially, culturally. And because we're not focused on it, the technology is not amplifying that desire. That desire doesn't exist strongly enough, and so there's nothing for the technology to amplify. I'm not saying that the technology is making things worse. I don't think that's true, at least in this context. But it's not helping in and of itself. We need something else. So, what does this mean for designs? It's not all bad news. I'll get into more constructive comments at this point. So one of the things that I think we have not done well in the design community, at least in those communities that consciously do design, is that we have switched from doing a certain kind of design, which is focused on often physical artifacts, to designing for social impact. And I'm going to suggest that this is a fundamentally different animal. Traditional design is about giving people more of what they want. Okay? You want to understand the user so that you can please them better, right? Design for social impact is actually about trying to cause some human change. You want to cause people to become better versions of themselves. And those are two very different things. Next, in traditional design, when you say human-centered design, usually it's about understanding people as individuals, maybe how they interact in groups and so forth, but you're rarely thinking about how they fit into a larger society. Once you get into the realm of trying to impact many people, you now have to see people as very complex organizations and groups and societies. And that's a fundamentally different thing. Another thing about traditional design, which goes back to this, is that if you give people what they want, they will pay for it. But my experience is that people very rarely will pay for things that are supposedly good for them. And when they do, they don't like it, right? Like, so for example, tuition. Why, people don't like paying tuition. They much rather spend that money on going on vacation and so forth. But it's, again, the people who have the motivation to actually pay for it that actually get the benefit. And then finally, much of what the work that people think of in traditional design can be designed into some kind of artifact, whether it's hardware, software, or possibly a larger technical system. Whereas in social impact, the hard work that human beings have to do to carry it out, to grow in some way, cannot fundamentally be packaged. And one way to think of this is that this is a difference between the following. Traditional design is about trying to design a better bicycle, a better way for people to use bicycles, a better way for cyclists to enjoy what they're doing. Design for social impact is getting more people to exercise. And those two are very different in what they're trying to accomplish. And as a result, I think we're talking about very different kinds of classes of projects, classes of design. So, again, if you go back to this idea that technology amplifies underlying human forces, then I believe this statement is exactly right, which is that the technology then depends on us in terms of how we use it, how we design it, and whether the results that we want come out of the technology. And there's a very subtle shift in what that means for designers. So, as people who design things, who engineer things, we tend to think of our main contribution as being the thing that we invent or produce at the end. But what I'm going to suggest is that the decisions that we make are the things that are important, not the final artifact, at least in this kind of social change context. If you believe that technology amplifies underlying human forces, then it follows that for technology to have positive impact, those underlying human forces have to be going in a positive direction to begin with. So there are several recommendations for people who do design. One of the things that I recommend all the time, because I have never seen this rule violated in a fundamental way, is that if you want to have positive social impact through some kind of design artifact, then the best thing you can do is find an existing social trend or organization that is already having that impact to begin with, and then help amplify that through some application of technology. So Rick and Gandhi, he was a member of the research team in India. He spun off this nonprofit called Digital Green. And Digital Green uses digital video in a particular way to help farmers learn better agricultural practices. But as much as this is about videos and digital videos, Digital Green could not have its impact unless it partnered with other agricultural organizations who have very good rapport with farmers. And it's because those other organizations exist and because they want to improve their methodology that this particular use of technology is helping. The converse side of that is that unless we have those partner organizations, there is a limit to how much the technology can have impact. So right now, Digital Green is running in a fairly large-scale way in both India and Ethiopia. And it's no accident that those two countries are two of the countries that have some of the strongest agriculture extension systems in the world, where the government pays for a significant amount of the agricultural outreach. The other thing that we can do as engineers and designers is to help train other engineers and designers. So, there's a tendency to believe, if you go back to this, is that somewhere in this transition, we imagine that the artifact is what's going to help people, right? Whereas it's very rare that the owning of a technology in of itself fundamentally causes a life change in you where you suddenly become richer, right? Most of you have some kind of smartphone. I would argue that when you buy a smartphone, you are helping make Apple employees and shareholders richer, but you're not getting dramatically richer. And that's also true for the poorest people in the world. You might get some value out of it, certainly, but that value is not the thing that fundamentally drives your socioeconomic growth. So this is a photograph of Patrick Awia. He was a Microsoft PM, originally from Ghana, and In 1995, he decided that he was done with his technology career, and what he wanted to do was help create a path for other Ghanaians to be able to do what he did. And so Ashesi University is now really a beacon of private tertiary education in West Africa. Just a couple of days ago, it was announced that Patrick won the MacArthur Genius Award. And then finally, I think we have to be very honest as designers about what kinds of problems we can solve and what kinds of problems might possibly be out of our scope, at least in terms of technology design. So does anybody know what this is a picture of? Perpetual motion machine, yes. So this is a perpetual motion machine. There's sometime, I think, between the 1700s and late 1800s, there was a time when people kept wanting to design these perpetual motion machines. They believed that you could create a machine that would just keep going by itself, right? Free energy, basically. And of course, this violates the laws of physics. And so every one of these things looks very clever on the front, but they eventually stop. And I want to suggest that we should get to a point where we understand what it is that technological design can do and where that boundary is, right? Like we cannot cause certain things. I believe I have a very abstracted theory of it, but I think it can be much more detailed, and it can tell us much more about what kinds of contexts design is useful in. The high level, I believe, boils down to these kinds of things. Things like, in and of itself, technology, no matter how well designed, does not fix dysfunctional human institutions. I don't think it shrinks inequalities in and of itself, and it doesn't make things more democratic in and of itself. But at this point, let me suggest that I might be wrong about some of these things, and it would be interesting to find counterexamples. So I still generally believe in amplification, but I do think that you could address inequality if you can find some social force that is out there in humanity to begin with, where people who are less advantaged somehow feel the power of it more strongly. And if you can amplify that in a positive direction, maybe we could start addressing inequalities through some kind of technological design. So I'll give you one example of that. Among sociologists, it is generally accepted that people with less education, who often tend to be poorer, have a stronger belief in luck as the critical way to improve their lives than personal effort. And it's been documented in a variety of different conditions. And oftentimes it's justified. Many of the people who hold these beliefs have grown up in a world in which no matter what they did, the outcome was just as bad as anything else. So one possibility is, can you take that belief and turn it into something positive? And it turns out that there are experiments run by economists where what they do is they effectively attach a lottery ticket to each time you meet some savings commitment. Right? So you open up a bank account and you say, I want to save this much money. Each time you get closer to that goal, you effectively get what is a lottery ticket. And it turns out that in some of these experiments, people not only end up saving more, but they actually play the lottery less, because now they're thinking, oh, now I get to keep the money and still play the lottery. Why would I pay money to play the lottery? Of course, the odds of their winning are not as good, but these are also the people who are somewhat insensitive to those kinds of distinctions. So it's possible that, for example, we could design some kind of, let's say, mobile phone and payment system which it replicates something along these lines, where you encourage people to save more, you encourage people to use fertilizer more based on lottery tickets. And the interesting thing about this is that even if they initially come into the program because they want to win something, at the end of it, they have gained something and will possibly have learned a valuable lesson, which is that they have the capacity to save, or that through some kind of action they take, their life gets better. And so you might have transitioned them to the mindset that is actually more useful. Another example that I'm actually personally interested in pursuing, although we haven't started much yet, is the role of organized religion. So again, for whatever reason, less educated populations tend to undertake activities in organized religion in a way that is very different from more educated people, even when they're religious. I remember when I was in graduate school, I was a computer science grad student, so I would often end up working late nights, and so I befriended one of the janitors who worked in the lab, and he invited me to go to his church. So I thought, okay, this is an interesting experience. I'll go with him. And and he lived in a relatively poor neighborhood. It's the kind of place where there were signs that said drug-free zone, which tells you that it's not. And the amazing thing was that the service was like 4 or 5 hours long on a Sunday morning, and I brought with me like $5, thinking that that would be good enough to drop in a collection plate. Well, the collection plate went around 4 or 5 times during the service, and each time the people to the left of me and to the right of me would like drop in $20 bills. And these were people who, by any other measure, you would think should not be doing that. And so to me, what that tells you is that there's this very powerful force that if you can align with or nudge in some direction, could conceivably be used to do a lot of positive things. I think especially in academia, we're very suspicious of religion in a general way, but at least in my experiences with a lot of the developing world, there's certainly some amount of proselytizing, but there are actually very good people who are out there building schools, building hospitals, who come from a religious background. And the amazing thing is that they are very good at involving the community in a way that's very positive. So that's another thing. And my guess is there are other such things. And if we can find ways to amplify those forces, then conceivably it helps shrink some of these socioeconomic inequalities. So yeah, I put that out there as a challenge for all of you designers. And I'm very eager to hear of any successes or even attempts that have that teach us something. So to summarize, as Scott mentioned, I have this book out, Geek Heresy, and this goes into much more detail about these ideas. But the central idea is that technology amplifies underlying human forces. And what that tells you is that if the underlying human forces are in disarray, then no amount of good technology is going to turn that around. And I believe that that is borne out in many, many examples at various different scales. And finally, the challenge is, can we find kind of latent human forces that we have not yet tapped into that could conceivably undo some of the injustice or inequality in the world simply because we don't think about them on a regular basis. And I'll end with that. Thank you. Questions?
Questions for Kentaro?
Well, I think it was a brilliant talk, but you failed to live up to the title.
Yeah. That might be true. So I should confess something about the way I do some of these talks, which I probably shouldn't say with all these impressionable students in here. But oftentimes I will write the abstract based on vague notions of what I think I'm going to say, and then I have to reconstruct the reasoning after the fact. But yeah. So yeah. Well, the title is a question. I'm not necessarily saying that it is or isn't. It might be. It might not be.
But it's very relevant to us because we are, in fact, trying to tackle exactly
Right.
the kind of problems you talked about, and we face exactly the issues that you described.
Yeah. I think there. So a lot of this depends on, as we were talking before this, what the definition of design is, right? So in some, conceptions of design, the problems that are left are still themselves potentially solvable through design processes. And some, in the somewhat more narrow definition of design that I've used here, I would say they're outside of that. But, depending on how you define design, it's a certain kind of problem solving.
I don't believe we can solve these problems. I think they don't have.
You think they may not have solutions?
But I think we can improve the world. We can
Right.
keep improving.
I certainly agree with that. None of this has stopped me from trying various different things.
So on your idea.org slide,
Yeah.
is it easy to pull up that one?
Yeah, sure.
I read that quote, and I think there's actually like a clever word in there that may get missed.
Yeah.
Which is the word believing.
Yes. Yes.
And one could argue, I don't know whether the folks that wrote this hold this view, but it seems to be written carefully that they're not actually saying that all of these problems
Are solvable.
are solvable.
Yes.
But rather that, the viewpoint seems to be that believing that they're solvable puts wind in the sails.
No, I think you're absolutely right. And you're right on the count that they have very carefully chosen their words. Mark Zuckerberg is not as careful. But these guys are very careful. If you read this, it's very difficult to point to specific sentences and say this is wrong. And in fact, you're right that this one does not say that. This one I think goes a little bit beyond, which is why I included it. And you're right. I think there's a lot of sleight of hand in the messaging that people put in. And frankly, if you go back to, let's say, Hillary Clinton, helps is another one of these words, right? A lot of people use the word can, and all of these words make the suggestion that the technology is going to solve this problem. And if you don't read it carefully at this level, you might walk away getting that general impression. But logically, they're hard to refute, because if you're only saying that it helps, then it is actually very directly consistent with what I say. But if you read the tone of the rest of her talk with respect to internet freedom, she is basically saying, rah, rah, let's get the internet out there and make sure that it is like the internet in America.
So one thing you and I were talking about a little bit before the talk is, given the insights that you have here, which I think are really powerful, what should, for the folks, many people here are graduate students, for those who believe the zeitgeist of the talk, what does that mean in terms of what kind of research they should be doing?
Well, so first of all, I don't think that everybody necessarily has to be working on the specific problems that I find interesting, right? Like there are plenty of problems in the world where people are unhappy even if they're not poor, for example, and I think those can be addressed. You may not agree that, for example, inequality is really that much of a problem, in which case, again, maybe that's perfectly okay, and then it doesn't matter as much. You might say that there are practical problems that your friends and colleagues all have, which need to be solved, many of which I think are admissible to technology solutions, and those are worthy of working on. The other option, of course, is that you intentionally go in a direction where you're doing less of the kind of let's design a technology, but let's work with some existing technology and see if we can bring more, change the human institutions around it. In some ways, people who are thinking of human-centered design are actually at this fulcrum of where people and technology meet, right? And so when you go off to other places, to other companies, to other universities, I would say that in some sense, you're the conscience of the technology industry, right? And so even if you're not directly addressing big problems, if you can ensure that Google is a little bit more careful about how it posts its results such that it it's fair or something like that, that those things I think have value. Yeah. So I think this makes our job tougher, especially if you're trying to have some significant social impact. But at some level, that's the reality of the world, and so it's also up to us to find ways to live with that and to manage it. Yes.
What caveats do you think there are to the statement that technology just amplifies human
Oh, that's a great question.
It seems like even in economics, it's careful design that's doing the nudging, and you could say careful design with social network systems nudges people in one way or another. So
Right.
I guess I'm pushing back. I think there's more than just amplification.
Yes, no, you're absolutely correct. So I think of amplification as the first order approximation of what happens. And I think it's sufficiently useful in explaining 90% of what happens and also preventing us from doing silly things, that it's useful in and of itself. And I don't think the message is out there enough. But you're right that it is just the first order approximation. So for example, one of the ways in which this is not true is that if you think of amplification, I'm presenting it almost like a scalar multiplication, right? Human beings decide the vector, the direction, and the magnitude, and then there's a scalar multiple. But actually, most of you have heard about affordances, right? Which is a technology has different affordances. And actually, human beings have different capacities, right? So you could think of yourself as a vector of different intentions and capacities. And you could think of amplification as being multiplication by a certain kind of matrix. And I don't believe that matrix allows for 180-degree rotations. But my guess is something like it's a positive semi-definite matrix that allows for some amount of rotation. Okay, this is engineering school, right? So it allows for a certain amount of rotation, which means that some technologies might cause you to kind of warp in a direction that you're not initially facing. So that's one possibility. Another one is that I'm mixing up intention and capacity a little bit. So there are some situations where the desire for something is much, much stronger than the person's capacity to execute it. And if you have the right kind of technology, that might boost things in a way that's different from just straight scalar amplification. Yeah.
Actually, even though I used the word amplification in the quote you gave,
Yeah.
I've argued against amplification. That Ed Hutchins and I have both argued that your abilities don't change, but you plus the technology are now capable of doing things that neither could do alone.
Initially.
And that actually your task changes, so that when, let's just take a simple calculator. When I do arithmetic, I make errors. When I use a calculator, I actually don't do arithmetic anymore. I let the calculator do it.
Right. That's right.
The combination is more powerful, but it's not really amplification.
Well, I would say it's amplification in the following way. So previously you were able to do a certain amount of mathematics. Now you can do even more.
Now I can do even less.
Well, you can.
But I plus
you,
my technology can do more.
Yes, exactly. Right.
That's a funny kind of amplification.
It's a funny kind of application in that it erodes your capacity to do something that you were previously able to do. But basically, your mental resources are now being allocated to something else. I mean, this is the exact phenomenon that we're seeing now as more and more, fancy technology supposedly is taking away, various kinds of jobs, right? And I would say that, you're right that, I'm not. The amplification is not explaining a whole bunch of phenomenon around technology and society, because my primary interest is in a certain class of social change. And in that class of social change, what I would argue is that, if you're, to begin with, if you're the kind of person who can do some of that arithmetic, in the new world, you'll be the kind of person who can better take advantage of the calculator. And that dynamic doesn't fundamentally change too much through the technology. There was another hand over here, yeah.
So, you building on your vector metaphor, because I had a question and
Sure.
that really helped me formulate it. If you could go to the slide that had the two columns.
Sure, yeah.
I just want to remember what they were called. So it seemed like in that vector metaphor, the goal of traditional human-centered design is to have the technology vector be in the same direction as the human vector.
Right.
And in human-centered design, where design becomes effortless and the interface disappears, then it approximates scalar multiplication.
Yes.
And then in design for social impact, it would be purposefully changing the direction to both amplify and change. So I'm wondering if designers are the people that are trying to amplify it, there are many people out in the world who are experts in social justice and like personal change and things like that, or like habit building. And I'm wondering, with your experience in, what was it, the Dalai Lama Institute, if you've encountered any people that have informed you in how to incorporate that into design for social impact.
Okay, so you're asking if...
I'm asking how, as designers, we can learn from people who are in fields totally unrelated to design, and use that to inform social impact.
So, that's a great question. So, one thing I would say is that as long as you're interested in social impact, it really behooves us to understand the existing research in the fields that are relevant, right? So, for example, if you're really interested in, let's say, changing governance, I mean, there's an entire, academic field called political science, right, where that's all they study. And not to know that literature and then to come in and say, okay, we're going to design this thing, is the equivalent of not asking, the user how whether your design is good for them, right? And so I think that there's some value in being a little bit interdisciplinary and trying to understand the fields that you're interested in. I don't think that necessarily means you have to become a specialist in that area, unless that's really what you want to do. But I do think that people often talk about T-shaped people, which is people who have a deep expertise in one area, but then have a breadth of knowledge about others. That helps more in this context, because you end up touching so many other disciplines. Let me go here, Derek.
So insofar as there's a field of ICT for D or HCI for development, what do you think they should do now?
I guess this is a follow-up to Scott's question. For some of them, I think they should stop. And I have said as much to groups that do these things. And I have to say they're amazingly gracious at listening to me tell them that their group shouldn't exist and so on.
How do you say that exactly?
I mean, I just come right out and say, I'm not really sure that your group should exist or should be funded. But yeah, in some cases, I think people should stop, because I think the real problem with, especially if you're interested in poverty, is that there is a very limited supply of resources that goes towards that work. I mean, it's on the one hand, it's in the billions and trillions of dollars. On the other hand, there's just not enough of it. And so as soon as you say, I'm going to suggest a laptop per child project for a million kids, and that's going to cost $100 million, that's $100 million that could not go to a program that is known to help children, right? And so I think that's a diversion of resources in the wrong direction. On the other hand, I do think that if you're sincerely looking for solutions and you're sincere and open to the possibility that your initial direction is wrong, then it's worth it for more of us to understand these problems and to try different solutions and to keep working at them. I do think that, again, it's important to know what other people have done as part of that. But I think there's still plenty of questions that we don't understand. Like even for example for amplification, I think there's lots of caveats, and each one of them is worthy of research.
So if you talked to yourself 10 years ago, the MSR Bangalore, is there any advice that you would have given at the time?
I would have told myself to do exactly what I was doing.
Great.
So one thing I did not get into is that this is just my personal theory and it's a lot of speculation, but I actually think that the number one thing that we really want is for every human being to become a better version of themselves. And what does that really mean? It means you want to follow your aspirations so that out of that you grow. And all of us are in this category, as well as people who are supposedly need our help. And I think as long as you do that in an earnest, conscious way, that it leads to your becoming the kind of person who's going to have even better impact in the future, right? So some of us have impact on 100 people, some of us have impact on 1 million people, but even if it's just 10 people, your being a better person means that those 10 people have a better impact. And so I think that's worth chasing, no matter what position you are and what you intellectually believe.
Isn't that the real amplification?
That's the kind of amplification we want to see more of. Yeah, Vineet.
So despite the message that you have, do you think we are moving in the right direction with all the technology bullshit that's happening, with all the valuable companies and people believing that a little bit of charity here and there through Facebook solves a lot of problems?
So I think if there's one thing that I would like to emphasize to people who are who end up in technology is that we should not assume that our products are going to be the answers to the big problems of the world, right? We're also citizens in addition to being technologists or engineers or designers, and so we should engage in that political sphere as much as in the professional way that we might be able to help. And the fact is, rich tech entrepreneurs do this, right? For example, in Silicon Valley, there are these, organizations that lobby to have more immigration for engineers in the United States. They know that moving that political machine is worth whatever the returns to them. But then, they don't engage in that kind of lobbying when it comes to philanthropic causes because, frankly, I don't think they're as sincere or earnest in those. Yeah. That's in the back.
One of the things that I'm kind of confused about is sort of the difference in technologies that you're talking about.
Okay.
So, I can understand why you wouldn't want to address poverty by, giving people who have different hierarchy of needs computers.
Right.
But then you showed slides where you showed people trying to get them easier access to water. Whereas I feel like there's fundamental technologies that really have democratized and have succeeded. Things like penicillin. That's an example where that's a technology, not in the sense of the digital technology, but clearly that's changed the world.
No, that's right. So, none of this is to say that people who are scientists and engineers and technologists should stop what they're doing in terms of creating more technology. There's a separate argument that suggests that as the technology becomes more powerful, it makes it easier for us to make a mistake and, end the world. But that's a separate question. I think there's value in science and engineering for its own sake because it does potentially give us more options, when we come to a point when we serve various crises. But the amplification law actually even applies to things like penicillin, right? So for example, if you look at the map of the world in which there are consistently vaccine-preventable diseases, right? Those countries which have a lot of high incidence of vaccine-preventable diseases, they correspond exactly to the countries which have very poor health institutions, right? So the technology exists, and in many cases it's cheap, but it is not getting to the people who most need it because those are the countries that don't have the institutions that would support getting it out to various people. And so, I'm not saying that we shouldn't have those technologies. We definitely want more of those. It would be great if we find malaria vaccines and so on, but the technology by itself won't solve the fact that those diseases exist. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it does. It's I don't know. It's like you're trying to, the fact that the disease exists, I don't see that as a necessary problem. I sort of think that our ability to deal with the disease is the problem, and sort of designing for that specific disease.
Right. So you would make a great medical researcher. There are other people for whom, look, we already have, let's say, the polio vaccine. But why does polio still exist? Why haven't we been able to eradicate like smallpox? And for the people who think that, the health system problem is the big obstacle. And those are people in public health and at the World Health Organization and so on.
That's interesting. So you're almost arguing for a public health equivalent for the field of design.
Yeah, I mean, I think as long as we're going to go in here, we now have a responsibility to think about these things, right? It's not enough for us to say, oh, we're neutral engineers and we're going to design things and let other people decide whether they use them or not, right? Again, I think because we do have this, human-centered side, those things, in some sense, we should be the conscience of the technology industry.
So isn't the compliment and the cleverness that's to what you're talking about behavioral economics? You gave the example of the lottery tickets and saving. I mean, that's again a piece of brilliance from behavioral economics.
Sure.
And so that would be, it's kind of design of economic behavior,
Right.
right?
So yeah, I mean, I would say that most social scientists are, depending on how you define design, are engaging in some kind of design activity, and this is what they think they're doing for their whole life.
They are doing
Yeah,
it.
that's right.
But actually, I think that behavioral economists are really applied social scientists.
Sure.
And much of design is applied
That's
social
true.
science.
I agree. Yeah. Yes.
And actually, when the book Nudge came out, I was asked to write a blurb on the back cover, and I said, "What? You're an economist. Why should I do that?" And I was told that, Rich Naylor came over to my place in Chicago, in Northwestern, and said, "I'm doing design." And when I read the book, I agreed.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's a wonderful note to wrap up on. Kentaro, thank you so much.
Thank
for
you.
coming
Thanks
on.
for having me.